Okay, so I am an immigration integration expert, if you want to say. And I'm actually going to talk about how it is that these two individuals had such divergent trajectories, even though they were brothers and came to the United States at the same time. A lot of the details that are here have been reported already, and you probably know a lot of this, but when you put them together, I think they provide a framework for understanding some of this. I'm interested in explaining how it is that these two brothers from the same origins had such very different experiences in terms of enculturation in the United States, and how did their trajectories eventually converge to create this sense of mass destruction. I was really happy to hear Professor Beshimov's presentation, because I think he talked a bit about this, which I think I'm happy to see. So I think that this framework really is something that brings together the brothers' age and psychological development at the time of arrival in the United States, also their previous experiences in the country of origin, their refugee status and reception in the United States. And these factors together provide clues into their varying levels of incorporation. I was reacting really to a lack of understanding that at the very beginning of the communications and news about these events that really looked at these bombers as immigrants, when in reality they're involuntary immigrants in this country, they're refugees, and I think that that's an important component of this situation. Both Yahar and Tamerlan came to the United States. Yahar was 8 years old and Tamerlan was 15. Both of them got involved in sports. They attended the mosque on Prospect Street here in Cambridge. They enrolled in Cambridge French and Latin. Some people would go as far as to say that Cambridge French and Latin is one of the most culturally accepting environments for higher learning. In this context, Yahar really thrived. He immigrated at a young age. He went to school with the same kids he was growing up with. He ended up having the same friends through all his school. He gradually lost his accent and became a well-liked and respected student. At least that's what we know so far. On the other hand, Tamerlan immigrated as a teenager, and I think we really need to recognize that immigrating as a teenager, as an adolescent, is really the most difficult time for anybody to immigrate. Okay, and this is important because he was 15 at the time. He became an excellent boxer, but never lost his accent, and his English was hard to understand. This opened him to discrimination. Anybody who has an accent in this country, unless you're really well-known and you are some type of personality, is discriminated against with an accent. We already know this, but refugees come from areas where conflict is historically embedded and marked in ideology and injustice. Refugees may suffer from what I call a refugee's deficit, and what I mean by that is basically understanding that you have escaped something that others have not been able to escape, and that that puts you in a deficit when it comes to the relationship you have with others that stayed behind. This is really important if you were an adolescent, at least an adolescent or a young adult, all the way to young adulthood, because then you integrated some of this information. So while Yahar was only a child during the war, Tamerlan experienced that civil conflict as an adolescent, shaping his identity as part of that conflict. It's very hard. We heard a lot of information about how this was very prevalent. So this was all of this historical injustice was very much alive as an adolescent coming to the United States. Once in the United States, Tamerlan could not find kinship with American youth. For most refugees, American youth seem to be extremely naive because they just don't have any kind of concept about this kind of conflict. This is not something that he could find very easy kinship in terms of talking to people about. This really kind of makes his networks be very selective when it comes to other people who have a similar background, and that also predisposes to particular trajectories. He did not, as he reported, he didn't understand Americans and he had no friends. Also, it's reported that Americans often assume that they were Russian. So if you're coming from Chechnya and people are calling you, oh, are you Russian? For Yaher, this was probably like a curious, motivating force. Maybe I want to find out more about this. But for Tamerlan, you can probably think that this was cumulative microaggressions. How many times do you have to tell people, no, I'm not Russian, I'm actually Chechen, when that is like so filled with a sense of injustice. As hopefully everybody knows, refugee status provides a legal path to citizenship. All of the immigration rhetoric right now in terms of the policies that we're considering all have to do with the undocumented immigrants. So they are the ones that don't have a path to citizenship. But refugees do. They go through a period of time when they are the refugee status, then they become permanent residents, then they have access to American citizenship. As Yahar got older, he continued his acculturation in Cambridge and attained American citizenship. On the other hand, Tamerlan was arrested for domestic violence. This was later dismissed. Nevertheless, this curtailed his application for US citizenship. Now, this appeared in the New York Times, I think 2 days ago, but Tamerlan was also a very good boxer. And it wasn't until he had captured his second consecutive title as the Golden Gloves heavyweight champion of New England that he was barred from the national tournament of champions because he was not a United States citizen. So these were the opponents, trainers basically were so upset with him because he was winning so much that they basically mobilized the association to take into consideration this rule that they had in the books but not really applying it so that it be applied against him and get him off of the boxing possibilities. That's a big blow. I mean, if you think in terms of somebody who's really wanting to be a boxer, who's really wanting to, that's what his dream is about. If suddenly the country that you're being integrated into decides that you're not American enough to be a champion boxer, these things are all what I call microaggressions. So we can think that the precipitants for this have to do with the fact that he was basically barred from the Golden Gloves. The Golden Gloves is like one step before Olympics. I mean, these are very high status boxers. He intensifies his relationship to Islam, goes to Russia. His family did not agree with the radicalization and actions landed the attention of the Russian government and the FBI that didn't mobilize on this. I think it's very important to realize that the parents moved back to Russia in 2011. This left the young son alone, okay, with this radicalizing brother. And he really admired this brother. So that left the younger son in a very vulnerable position. And this is how their different trajectories converged while Tamerlan died. In the confrontation, he left the younger brother alone to face the consequences. So what do we have for recommendations? I think we need to develop policies specifically directed at refugees who have the migratory transition in the midst of their adolescence. This has implications for their identity development. And this is, there are the refugee population, I don't know exactly how many there are, but it is something that's doable. I mean, if you just look at the adolescents in that population, I think we could do a lot just with that by paying attention to that particular population. We need to provide psychological services that include exposure to pro-social networks, offering opportunities for support and leverage that will lead towards integration, not isolation. And I truly believe that failure to act in this preventive way will continue to have like young people who come from places where there are very strong senses of historically embedded injustices, who then are very easy prey to a narrative like the narrative of Al-Qaeda. It's just very easy to make this jump when you have been brought up in that with that particular background, and you have this deficit this refugee deficit that really kind of makes you want to fight, even though you're not able to. So this is, I think, a very complicated factor that will really help if we pay attention to refugee immigrant children who come here as adolescents. So that's it. I want to put this back.
Thanks very much, Silvia, and thanks to you all for being very patient. The microphones are open, and what we'll do is ask you to identify yourself. Please come to the mics. There's one on each side. Please direct your question at individual speakers, or if you would like anyone to sort of take up the challenge, that's fine too. We'll start over here. Yes, sir. Please identify yourself.
Okay. My name is Martti Vallila, is the way my name is pronounced in my former country. I'm a refugee here, actually, or an immigrant. So one of the questions I have is this term refugee deficit. I find a little bit strange. I'd learned English when I came here. English was the 5th language I had to learn, but I learned it. So I'm not sure about this refugee deficit idea. The specific question I have for you is, you made a statement, I'm speaking to the last speaker there, yes. You said that everyone who speaks with an accent here in the United States is, what was your term? Yes, is discriminated against.
No, well, let's just say that having an accent opens up the possibility of you being discriminated.
Opens up the possibility of you being. Can you give me one example that of someone with an accent where they're discriminated against?
This happens every day. I mean, I've been discriminated against for having an accent.
You have?
Yeah. I mean, I think
In what, give me an instance.
Just in terms of what people perceive and what kind of stereotype they may place you, or
no, give me an example of you're saying in your life you have an accent.
Yeah. Well,
okay.
I think that people have treated me differently once they have heard me speak in certain situations.
Well, no, give me an example.
Can we go on? Please, yeah, please.
Okay. No, I'm just.
Please, you've asked the question. The professor has responded. If you're not satisfied, I apologize on all of our behalves for that. But let's go to the next question here.
First, just thanks for a fantastically interesting panel.
Chris, would you identify yourself?
Across the board. My name is Christopher Leyden. I'm a blogger and journalist across the board in many media. I just wanted to note this. The New Yorker popped into my box today, has a very interesting piece by Steve Cole, who has forgotten more about the Afghan wars than most of us will ever absorb. It's a post-Boston reconsideration of the drone wars. And of course, it does not connect the drone wars to Boston, but it raises questions, and I think Steve Cole is hoping and maybe expecting that the Boston Marathon bombing will sharpen and open an American conversation about the purposes and the effects of the drone war. But specifically addressing Professor Krause's fascinating question. I mean, it's really a profound question. What did they think that would accomplish? What was the hope or the purpose, if there was one, rational, irrational, or otherwise? I just throw it out there that as a non-fan of the drone war, maybe that's part of my bias, but what if the purpose of that they're thinking, again, rational, crazy, whatever, hateful, jihadist, however we classify it, what if the purpose was to show us our own reaction to this kind of attack? And in a sense, to show us the ineffectiveness of our own counter-terrorist killings and signature strikes over there in the Islamic world. What is this to say? Like, how does this feel to you? And reconsider in the light of our anger, our outrage, our horror, our regret, etc., what the effects of this of vaguely comparable attacks are over there.
Peter, why don't you get started,
Sure.
and others can pick it up.
This pick me up right in here, I guess. Or speak,
Yeah, the mic
speak
is-
loudly.
mic is
I have no
working.
problem speaking loudly, as you guys saw before. I probably talked too loudly. So, great question. So I'll say real quick. I mean, I don't know if you've seen, there are a couple polls about how Americans feel about drones, and it's very interesting. You know, the majority of Americans are supportive of using drone strikes abroad, but then the question comes to what about drones on the U.S.-Mexican border or domestic drones, and then the number goes way down. So there definitely is kind of a disconnect there, but apparently in terms of the technology and whether it's kind of for thee but not for me, or these types of questions that I think were the bombers thinking in that regard, there's a lot of, you know, kind of potential traction there they could be trying to expose or getting us to think about. But just as I'm, you know, even though I talked a lot about this stuff in kind of the context of political violence, and I'm still a little bit hesitant to say that this attack was necessarily political, I still don't think we 100% know that for sure. I definitely don't think that I feel like there's enough evidence yet to say they were doing it for the motivations that you were saying. So while I do think, you know, from the classes that I teach, I've had a number of students who have raised questions along these lines and saying, well, you know, this is a tragedy. Some of them were running the marathon and were within a minute or two of where the bombings happened, but we talk a lot about intervention in Syria or places where, you know, 70 or 80,000 people have been killed, and so how do you compare those, or why do I care so much more about this one down the block than, you know, that one over there? And I think those are worthwhile questions to ask. I mean, I think at the same time, sometimes it gets a bit more extreme, and it's kind of like, you know, if your mother's ill and someone comes to you and says, well, 70 other thousand mothers are ill at the time, I mean, obviously you care about your mother. You have personal and family ties. You care about things in your community, like the officer was killed here. So I think to some degree that's understandable. That's being human. At the same time, I do think that there definitely is a disconnect. Some people here pointed to the fact that in America, thankfully to some degree, but nonetheless, we do live in a bit of a naive bubble about some political violence, don't face it the same way other societies necessarily do. So I think that whether that was the intention or not of the bombers, and I don't think there's enough evidence to yet say it was, I do think I have seen some of this reconsideration or thinking and connecting this to that broader context. And I'm not sure what the result of that conversation will be, but I do see this evidence of this.
Yeah, if I could comment
Please,
also. The question I think you're asking is, are we looking at this in a political framework, or are we looking at it in terms of psychology? So I think it's very tough, because I think the examples that we had before in previous years, we have Dr. Hassan at Fort Hood, you know, killing 13 people. You had also with a jihadist background, if you will, or taking that framework. But you also have Timothy McVeigh, and people forget Timothy McVeigh was using fundamentalist Christian language in the months before he went out, you know, went and blew up the building. So I think it's really difficult. There can be political metaphors, but when you have just two people or one person, are you really looking at some great political message, or are you looking at someone seeking the exhilaration of violence, of doing something mortally terrible and enjoying it, see, and wanting it? And I think that looks like more of a driver in this particular case than even 9/11, by the way. Certainly.
Others on the panel? Okay, sir?
Hi, I'm David Williams. I'm a student here. I haven't been following it completely that much. You can correct me if my information's wrong, but one of the disconnects I find in hearing the news is, you know, there's the bombings, and then there's a lot of behind-the-scenes work being done by the police, and then there's sort of this disconnect till Thursday night when Jeanne was killed. And, you know, the question that has not been answered to me is, why did they shoot him? And so the idea is, I know they're terrorists, so they're not exactly the most logical people, but, you know, they made a clean getaway, so why did they just go out and assassinate someone? So really a lot of proof says that, you know, their videos were out, they were being looked for. So basically what I'm getting at is, it seems though that the FBI, the police, by releasing the photos, sort of put pressure on them to cause these murders. You know, they're walking down the street, they bump into Jeanne, they see a police officer, they think they've been recognized, and then, you know, all of a sudden they're throwing grenades. Like, it doesn't sort of make any sense. And I was wondering if you guys, what you thought about whether releasing their photos was the appropriate thing to do. Because not only did it encourage them to lash out, but it also could release, false identifications and, other sorts of issues of vigilantism and stuff like that.
Thank you. Jeanne, that sounds like it's for you or Peter.
You go back to the Unabomber case. Remember the Unabomber? They went through all of this issue about should we release his letters, his political tracts, and put them in the Washington Post and Times, and was this a good thing? And it turned out it was a good thing, because in fact his Ted Kaczynski's sister-in-law and then the brother recognized the language, and it actually solved the case. So that set a precedent for how much do we ask of the public. In the Bruce Ivins case, in the anthrax letter case, before they even think about Bruce Ivins, the FBI worked with the American Society for Microbiology and sent out messages to 250,000 members of the American Society for Microbiology, asking them if they had a colleague they thought was a little odd or might have fit the profile of someone with hidden anger. And I can tell you they did get answers. You can imagine the answers that came back, right? And one of the answers that came back was a woman who had known Bruce Ivins and had been a graduate student when he was a graduate student. And interestingly enough, the FBI interviewed her out in Oregon. 2 guys went out, just like here. The local people came out and interviewed this person, and they dropped it. They didn't think it was important, so they wrote a little report, but they couldn't believe that a man who worked at Fort Detrick, right after 9/11, could ever be the suspect. So, because of this question of how much do we ask the public to participate, and I know, personally, I know that the people here in Boston, the field officers here, gave it a lot of thought. It wasn't something that they wanted to do, but there is this idea, and I think you've expressed it very, very well, that you could be enlisting the public in identification, but you could also be influencing what is going on that could be very negative. So I know they went back and forth on it, but in this particular case, it was the better idea. But I think the negative, the downside of it, absolutely right. You're right.
A couple quick points. That was a great question. So a couple of things, just on the rationality point, because you brought that up. I think it's a really tough thing for us to get our minds around sometime, because these are individuals who it seems like, put bombs in backpacks and then put them down at the feet of an 8-year-old child and looked at that child's eyes maybe and then walked away knowing that they were going to kill that individual. So in one sense, you think, how could that person be mentally stable? How, that's a mentally ill thing to do. On the other end of things, very, very small percentage of people who commit terrorist acts are actually diagnosed as mentally ill before or after. So even though we might have a hard time thinking how someone could kill another individual like that, in terms of kind of diagnosed before or after with having mental illness is actually quite a small percentage. That's maybe scary to think about, but that's kind of one point. In terms of the stories about why they killed Sean, some of the things I've seen is that they wanted to get his gun and they were unable to do so because it had kind of like multiple locks into it. So they wanted to kind of up the ante in terms of the weapons they had, which is interesting. They had a number of bombs, but not that many guns. Again, getting to the fact that on the one hand, these guys were anomalous in the sense that they were able to build a bomb that worked. On the other hand, they were kind of like Keystone Cops afterwards in terms of not having any idea what their getaway plan was, what the next step was, even though they had these other bombs. So in that sense, they weren't necessarily prepared. In terms of releasing the photos, I agree with Jeanne. I think it was the right thing to do, but I think you're also correct to note, and Jeanne was correct to note, the public played a huge role here. They were the ones, like the lockdown seemingly made a difference, but then the best intel came right after they lifted it, right? So that's key. But then it's also important to note that the public did some of the worst things here, right? Like if you follow Reddit or some of these other things that I know a lot of people, take as, not necessarily the Bible, but something they really think is a great thing, they falsely identified a number of people and kind of, necessarily ruined their lives, but did a lot of bad things by saying, oh, is this the bomber? New York Post did that. So the public is both kind of the greatest asset and resource, and I think one of the reasons the FBI released these photos because they needed their help, but also, a real danger there. So I think at the end of the day, they made the right choice, but you're right to raise the fact that it's a dangerous game for sure.
Anyone else? Sir.
Well, reports in the European press and elsewhere have actually said that the younger brother, after he was captured and was asked what the motive was, stated that it was very clearly and explicitly, perhaps the only question that he answered, was that it was Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's grimly, morbidly, even kind of ironic that on the same day as the Marathon atrocity, there was a bombing in Iraq that killed 27 people. In the month of April alone, 561 civilians have been killed by terrorist attacks in Iraq, and we started off May today with 15 more. And as has been mentioned before, we don't seem to have the same remorse or outpouring of grieving, even though we're directly responsible for that train of events, not to mention the thousands and thousands that were killed by the wars and the genocidal sanctions. So I'm wondering why, and if we can blunt some of this anger, if we held war crimes tribunals, and if we held people responsible for torture and other acts of crimes against humanity, even though they may be some of our own officials.
Steve, it sounds like for you.
To me, the best insight into the motives behind the attack is the YouTube account that Tamerlan Tsarnaev maintained. And there he seems to link to, he posts a couple of videos, one of which is a standard Al-Qaeda video. It's got a twist on it. The preacher is a fellow I've never heard of before, but he's an Australian. I think his name was Reed. Does anyone remember the guy's name?
He's Australian.
Can't recall. And the narrative involves a place in Central Asia, Khorasan, which actually was an ancient political entity, and how the people of Khorasan are some going to sweep through the Middle East and solve all the problems and bring about the end times. So to me, I'm not so sure that Afghanistan and Iraq are the only piece of the puzzle. They're part of the narrative, but I think that they were animated by this larger narrative, which is pretty much universal throughout sort of Al-Qaeda land, and it takes the same form. And the complaints extend way beyond Afghanistan and Iraq to a general war of civilizations. It's a victim narrative about war of civilizations. And so I think you have to address this larger narrative. And it's a great question, you know, if the United States, this is a research question, key question, what if the U.S. withdrew from the world? Would Al-Qaeda, if you will, follow at home? And scholars all disagree on that. Bob Pape has written a terrific book on suicide bombing, arguing essentially that you see very rarely see it emanating from places that aren't in some way suffering actual occupation. And the other view is more of a narrativist view, that people have big imaginations and can direct their anger even at people who are very remotely connected to the suffering they're actually feeling if they accept an identity narrative that suggests that their nation has been wronged by others, you know, in the past or today. So I guess I focus more on the wider Al-Qaeda narrative. I don't think we're going to solve it just by undoing, if you will, or in some way backing out of Iraq and Afghanistan. Although I think, you know, the war in Iraq was an absolute disaster and made things much worse, much worse.
Carol, did you want to get in on this?
You know, we could speculate about their motives all day. We don't know. The interesting thing is that there's a Russian scholar who's at the Carnegie Center in Moscow, who's an expert on the North Caucasus, and he has a completely different hypothesis that I just think I should throw out there, that I guess it's ethnic stereotyping in some sense, that the Chechens and the people from the North Caucasus are very insulted by any kinds of derogatory comments that are made about them, and that somebody, his hypothesis is that somebody personally slighted either of the two brothers, and that's what motivated the attack, because the Chechens have historically responded with great force. I just throw it out there because it's a completely alternative explanation given by somebody who really does study this part of the world. So, for what
Taylor, is there some other possibility?
Anyone else? Sir, I'm sorry, I neglected to ask the previous gentleman to identify himself. If you would, please.
My name is Alexander Rasolimo. I'm chairman of a think tank, the Center for Security and Social Progress. There seems to be confusion in the minds of many people about the nationality or ethnicity of the two alleged perpetrators. For instance, Newton Tabb today had an interview with a Russian-born resident of Newton. She was outraged that these two bombers were described as Russians, and perhaps recalling the poem by Mikhail Lermontov, the Kazakh lullaby. She said, no, they're not Russians, they're Chechens. And on the other hand, a couple of days after the marathon bombing, I think the president of Chechnya or Dagestan said no, these two were influenced by America's culture, by the U.S. environment, so they're not the Americans. And of course, they were both legal residents, and one of them was a citizen. So my question is, if you were to ask to characterize these by one term, what would you call them, if anything, nationality-wise?
Thank you.
Well,
Elizabeth?
technically, they're half Chechen, half Avar. Their father is Chechen and their mother is Avar. But as we've seen, they grew up in at least four different parts of Russia and Kyrgyzstan: Kalmykia, Dagestan, Chechnya, and Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan probably. What I think is also interesting is to think of them. I'm going to shift the hypothesis about them yet again. What if we think of them, and this has been suggested by other people, as weak, wonderful discussion of the refugee deficit. They come in, they're unstable. They look for the most radical narrative they can find. If they had been Christians, they would have found a fundamentalist Christian narrative. So they find the jihadist Al-Qaeda narrative. But there's another piece of this, and I don't want to do conspiracy theories because we're not supposed to, but the question is who's interested in them finding this particular narrative? And it seems to me entirely, we have no idea. It was Tamerlan completely self-radicalizing? Entirely possible. Was he radicalizing because he met other jihadists from the Northern Caucasus? Also possible. A third possibility, which is remote, but I don't think we should completely discount it, is that the FSB somehow found him, knew he was weak, and sent him to radical jihadists. And so that there's also a possibility that the Russians are stirring this up as an excuse to then go into Sochi. The fact is we probably will never know. It's possible that Jahar will survive and he will talk about this, but I think we have to think of them not for their nationality, but for their fragility, for their vulnerability, for the fact that they then go to find the most radical. The mother was arrested for shoplifting outside of Lord & Taylor's. The bomb is dropped outside. One of the bombs was outside of Lord & Taylor's. Can we make that kind of psychological leap? We don't know. I think it's too far to go all the way to them wanting us to experience drones. But it's not too far to say them wanting to, either buying into this jihadist network language, or them wanting to inflict suffering in a way that's going to be very visible. I don't know. I pass it to Bakyt.
I personally used the Chechen background of two brothers in order to explain especially Tamerlan's beliefs, because without the Chechen history, because without his connection to his home country, Chechnya, and home country of his mother, Dagestan, it's very difficult to understand his beliefs and behavior. After that, if we take just two dimensions of their character, for instance, Johar is more American Chechen, but Tamerlan is more Chechen American, and he is less American. After that, I am a little bit skeptical about self-radicalization. I continue to think that he was in some way influenced, manipulated, and he, in my view, he came. Maybe he was a part of some kind of group where we discussed this kind of ideas. And after that, it was mentioned in press and media that he cannot understand Americans and he hasn't any friends among Americans. But he got married to an American girl from Suffolk University. How you can imagine this understanding that he dated with her? And he dated, and they spent a lot of time with her friends, Americans, with his friends, Americans, and so on. Therefore, I accepted these words from Tamerlan words just as exaggeration, and just as in my view, a little bit lightly used evidence of his alienation from the American society. I don't believe to that. And I think that he, if you pay attention to his just YouTube, all his episodes, you will find that he paid a lot of attention to the Chechen culture. Chechen culture, which is very connected to Chechen mujahideens. For instance, I listen almost all the songs of very famous Chechen singer Mutsuuro, who, in my view, hugely influenced to his beliefs.
Silvia, did you want to add something? The room is listed to this side. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Abdi, and I'm a freshman here at MIT. So, after the week of the bombing and tragic death of the officer...
I'm sorry, could you just speak up a little bit?
Yes. After the week of the bombing and the tragic death of the officer, a lot of people, specifically my friends, like the first question they would ask was, why did these two brothers do why did they do what they did? And like a lot of them were quick to just say that they're crazy, that they were, as like the uncle put it, losers. And like that, those kinds of answers never really satisfied me. So then I suggested that possibly there's some more global like influence. And the response I got from my friends, good people, but at that time had really strong emotions, was that I was profiling, I was showing some form of racism, which I thought was absurd because the brothers are Muslim, I'm Muslim. I wasn't being discriminatory, I was just considering that there could be a more complex answer. So my question may be directed towards Mr. Krause is, how do you fight this, this environment where people, in trying to be tolerant, almost neglect these other possibilities of motives in either a more global context or some other context?
Sure. So first off, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head in this, what I was trying to talk about in my speech, but maybe much more eloquently, which is, there's two kind of competing issues here, and I think one of the ways we deal with this stuff that's politically sensitive is to put our heads in the sand and just say, let's not talk about it because it's tough to talk about. And I think that's not the way to go. So I think, first and foremost, talking to your roommates or friends about it is a good thing. The second thing I will say is, I think that there's elements of what you're saying that I agree with, and I would look at the other side as well, which is, okay, on the one hand, I think that you can say that someone could have a motivation or claim a motivation that's religious or political or whatever else, and we should be able to note that and study that and see to what extent that's an issue and that's something that the United States or otherwise as citizens we should consider, without having to then say, and therefore the people who are all share that ideology or religion or whatever else are therefore also a problem. That's not a leap that you have to make, but I think that that's probably how your friends or roommates are kind of saying that, because sometimes people do make that leap, right? They say, oh, well, this individual claimed that they committed the attack because the taxes are too high or because the US invaded this country or whatever else. So therefore, anyone else who feels that way is a problem. Now, one of the things that I study, because I study social and national movements, is that most of the political violence that happens is not extreme in the sense of the objectives that it's for, it's the end. It's the means of how they're trying to achieve it. So much of the violence that happens like this, terrorist violence or otherwise, is not strange in the sense that it's trying to accomplish an objective that a lot of other people don't share. In fact, it's usually part of a broader community that shares that objective or that ideology or something else, but they're able to pursue it individually or peacefully or otherwise. And I think sometimes that's how these attacks, going back to the previous question about effectiveness, are actually very counterproductive. But what they do is they tar the name and the legitimacy of that broader movement, which many of the people otherwise might think is quite legitimate. So one could have, legitimate objectives to U.S. foreign policy, on a variety of grounds, but still not support, the killing of civilians in the United States to kind of, fight against that, right? So I guess my answer, just in short, to what you were saying is, I don't think if these individuals, it turns out that they have this kind of jihadist ideology and they're saying that that's a reason that they did this or that's a problem. I think what Steve is talking about, to study this stuff, to understand what exactly the narrative is, to what extent we as citizens or as governments can deal with this stuff or grapple with it, I think that's important. But as I say, I would just be as passionate at dealing with things in the society where people who are going a step beyond that and being bigoted or racist against certain groups. To me, both of those are necessary to be able to get at this issue. If you just do one or the other, you're not going to get there, and that's when you get to either profiling in a way that's very counterproductive and not in line with what I consider to be U.S. values, or in the other way, which is you're kind of just saying, well, this happens with all ideologies or whatever else, so I'm not really going to study it, or it's politically sensitive, so I don't want to talk about it. I don't think that's the way to go either.
Thank you.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I just also wanted to add on this question, I think it's also very important that they come from a region where activists, again, people not always that we would think are very savory, are being murdered, assassinated on a weekly basis. So that fact, and for two reasons. One is the psychological effect of growing up in countries torn by violence. It affects the frontal lobes of the brain. And the other is that when you've seen all these people being killed, then your sense is, and we have evidence that Tamerlane was in Russia for 12 months from January to July. This is the period everyone's asking about. And in that period, two leading...
one of whom was a friend.
And one of them, this man Plotnikov, who has a similar biography, went to Canada, grew up in Canada, then becomes a terrorist in his own right. I'm not saying he's savory at all, but if there's a sort of domino effect, then I think that's also possible. And it helps to say, no, we're not saying all Muslims are bad. Far from it. We're saying that people who've become radicalized in very difficult circumstances, of course, are imbibing that impulse to violence, both because of the neurological effects on them, and this goes back to the drones. I mean, if we're dropping bombs on children growing up in countries, then we need to think about what it's like from the perspective of young people growing up there.
I think, Peter, when you were talking, I was thinking about the history of the Chechen wars themselves. That first Chechen war was not an Islamist undertaking in any way, shape, or form. It was a secular nationalist movement with an attack from Russia on Chechnya. I think there are people, even after the second Chechen war and the Islamicization of at least some of the fighters, I think that there are probably secular nationalists in Chechnya who share the objective of Chechen independence or getting rid of the Russians or whatever, who would not necessarily subscribe to the use of terrorism to accomplish that goal. And I think we need to be very, very careful about stereotyping whether it's culture or all the Chechens are now Islamists and everything else, and I think we really need to be very nuanced in our discussion of the whole topic.
I think it's peculiar, though, and this is a question I keep asking myself, why Boston? Of all places, or even why, I can understand the Boston Marathon is very international, it's a happy day, but that's where the issue of what is the political goal here falters for me, because I could see if they got in a car and went to New York, or I can see other things to do, or target a government building, or where, but the thing about the marathon is it's a very happy time. So there's a certain darkness here, and I also think about, Freud and the death instinct. What is going on here that is so incredibly negative? And yet the counterbalance, of course, is the seeking of notoriety, fame. Fame's a value. And so that's why I quoted William James. The notion that you're split in two, from that notion that you're split in two and that there's tension, you can resolve that tension with some violent act. And this, by the way, is William James writes about that. And he says that violent act can be some cataclysm. It maybe takes you over and you can't even control it, but you will gain integrity because of this, or you will commit suicide, because suicide is the other resolution of that problem of the divided self. So I mean, these are all imponderables, I think, at the moment.
Steve?
It's interesting, we have some disagreement about what motivated the attackers. I saw this from the very beginning as a standard al-Qaeda attack. It even fits the sort of cookie cutter that you'll find, people describing the AQ method around the world. Strike a symbolic target, Boston Marathon, symbolic of American freedom, yada. Do it with careful thought given to the to camera angles, because it's all about PR. They put the bombs in the place where the cameras would catch it most likely. Al-Qaeda likes to do two things. They like first you hit this, then you hit that. They never attack, with a single blow. Again, we saw the 2 bombs. Looked to me like they'd been kind of looking up stuff on the net as to how the standard AQ attack is carried out. And I think that the process by which they became radicalized followed closely the way we've seen others radicalized by their contact with Anwar al-Awlaki, who was the radical preacher in Yemen, who seems to have influenced Hassan, the guy who attacked Fort Hood, and he seems to have influenced the guy who attacked Times Square, tried to attack. So to me, this was looked to me like rather cookie-cutter standard al-Qaeda attack. And if so, religion has a lot to do with what happened here. And I liked the question Adi asked. It's a great question, how to talk about this in the context of religion, and how to bring up the fact that there's a religious dimension here, and if we don't deal with it, we're not dealing with the reality. Now, I guess I'd say 2 things. One is, every religion has their crazies. Every religion has their crazies. And I think we need to have sort of a different discourse in the world in which the crazies of every faith are called to account and are held accountable, because they have to be. Now, how can we do that in a way that doesn't stigmatize or lead to blaming or scapegoating the larger faith of which they're part? These jihadis are a teeny-weeny piece of the Muslim world. They're a minority within a minority. They're an extremely small segment of the whole. So it's very both inaccurate and immensely unfair to stigmatize the wider Muslim community for their actions. Same goes for the crazies in the Jewish world, the crazies in the Christian world. I mean, Christian world, so one of you mentioned that Timothy McVeigh had Christian affiliations. The truth is the entire U.S. militia movement is essentially formed around a perverted, deviant Christian sect. It started out as, the sect was 100 years ago, it was known as British Israelism. It then sort of metastasized, or I don't know what you want to say the process was, into the so-called Christian identity movement, Christian identity philosophy. There's a terrific book by a guy named Barkin all about the Christian identity worldview, if you want to read it. The American media, I think, have done a huge disservice by not explaining that the Oklahoma City bombing and the related militia violence by the other militia movements, including the Montana militia, the Michigan militia, the other ugly militias, all emanated at root from a crazy Christian movement. And, you know, people don't want to be impolite and explain this as Christian.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Do you think that the 2 brothers were part of a group? That's the difference.
I don't think we know, but I think the
Okay.
primary channel for their radicalization was the internet.
Okay.
That's what I think. As we saw with these other guys I mentioned, Hassan and so on, these guys who were affected by al-Awlaki. So what's the suggestion? How shall we talk about this? One suggestion I've offered, Peter and I put it in an article some time ago, is we need an NGO that will serve the function of raising criticism against the use of religious authority for hate. The name I use for it is Religious Hate Watch, okay? Why not have an NGO that does the same thing in the area of religious hate that we have in the area of human rights, where Human Rights Watch tries to use naming and shaming to identify, call to account, and perhaps abate the use of religious, in that case, human rights abuses. We have Transparency Watch to call to account corrupt governments. To me, we need to have, if you will, a neutral player that is going to have a agreed universal standard for the comportment of religious communities, to avoid the idea that when we call to account those who use God's authority for hate, that you're discriminating, that you're pointing the finger at one community. The idea would be, well, let's agree that every faith condemns this, and no faith wants to be used in this way, and every faith therefore agrees to support some kind of, shall we say, even standard that shall be applied to all faiths, that they shall not use religious authority for hate, and they shall take action against members in their community who do it.
Yes, sir.
By the way, I think that's a great suggestion, and it should get traction, Steve, without having to reinvent the wheel. With the Southern Poverty Law Center, for example, being a great example of folks who are working along those lines.
I'm really suggesting exactly that we take the Southern Poverty Law Center and somehow grow it global. That's what I would like to see happen.
Here's the question I wanted.
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, sure, Joseph Regna. This is the question I wanted to have folks address, if possible. Silvia, you finished your presentation with the thought, and I'm paraphrasing, what brings people to want to fight? And I know I'm not doing it justice, but I think it was something like that. And here's what I want to posit. You know, I could have drunk the jihadist Kool-Aid, and Steve did a great job of explaining what that is. I could totally understand the geopolitical context. You know, Carol and Elizabeth and Bakyt, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, also mentioned some of the background there. And I'm familiar with Peter's work from your stint at the Belfer Center. And, you know, Jeanne, of course, is always doing some great stuff. And Silvia, I appreciated your refugee deficit concept as well. So all of that could be true. And yet, why go to violence? Don't we have options? So I'm pissed off because the group that I self-identify with has been on the short end of some stick, and I have a grievance. Why choose to bomb anybody? And why not seek some other quote-unquote nonviolent method of expressing my anger and rectifying the situation? Probably that's a question for another conference, but...
Well, we'll give it to Silvia and see what...
You know, I think the majority of refugees do that, exactly what you're saying. I mean, most, you know, they end up doing whatever work they do that puts that kind of a motivation into something constructive as opposed to destructive. So I think that that's what happens on a regular basis in terms of refugee resettlement. You know, this really points out that there is a population we need to take, you know, more, observe more and take more, be more careful around, and that's adolescents. I think that adolescents, when they come in the middle of their identity development, I think that in itself is already problematic. So if they come already with some ideology, and then there's you know, a much more radicalized way of looking at that ideology because they were already Muslim. It's a much shorter jump to go to a narrative of Al-Qaeda narrative, as Steve mentioned before. So I think that I think most refugees deal with that in a very productive way. I don't think that the majority of them don't do these things, but I think that for some, this is the kind of situation that will result.
If I could just add a thought, Joseph, it's a great question, great point. And my view is that extreme events and extreme behaviors almost always have multiple causes, and usually multiple interacting causes. So I don't mean to suggest when I point to the jihadi narrative that it was the sole cause. I think that was a key factor. Without it, there would have been no attack. But factors that Silvia's pointing to as well, the trauma that these folks suffered, both as your concept of refugee deficit, you know, I'd never thought of it before, but that's fascinating, or the, you know, adolescents coming and, you know, not integrating and being alienated, or Jeanne's whole point about psychology, and perhaps we're dealing to some degree with psychopathy or sociopath conduct, folks who enjoy violence. You understand Hitler's violence? Well, you have to understand he was an anti-Semite. He also enjoyed killing people. These two things have to fit together to understand the Holocaust, in my opinion. So I think we had a number of causes here, and they were each necessary but insufficient to bring about what happened.
Please, Bakyt.
When we, from my experience, when we approach to this kind of people with claim that why you go to violence, why not our more peaceful means, it's a first mistake. Because you would like apply to them your own version of reality. But their version of reality is different from you. And first of all, it's important to understand their worldview, their beliefs, their version of reality. And I do believe that one recommendation is merit of our attention, because this is radical jihad could be defeated by the beliefs which is close to the Islam, but will be more powerful and more inspiring, and which can turn the minds of people to a more positive way.
Thank you. Yes,
think
sir.
it's a great question, the issue of violence. In neurobiology now, of course, there are the studies of the brains of the murderers. It's rather famous. There's a new book out about it. But I think we feel that's an overly simplistic approach. But there is something that does go on that differentiates one person from another. A lot of people suffer as refugees, or they suffer in their lives, but they don't get violent. And so I think there is that larger context. The glorification of violence, by the way, if you're in a militarized society, that's an identity. That becomes an identity. So legitimate killing, we have legitimate killing. So why not have another way? Why not look for other ways? Peace, I think, is a good idea. I think Steve's on to peace, and I think that's it.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, Steve Whitaker. So just following up on the previous question, another way of looking at it and follow up on where it takes us is, so the other question is, why not turn to violence? So if you look at a lot of conflicts, the Palestinian conflict, for example, that was one where if that had happened here, we would clearly have turned to violence. And the Palestinian conflict, for example. There's no way that we would have allowed an external power to kind of drop a nation on top of us without turning to violence. The Revolutionary War shows that, etc. So one thing that's surprising is why there isn't more violence that emerges from these types of things when, if you look at some of the conflicts during the 70s and 80s where groups said, okay, it's not working at home, we're going to take that conflict to the people that could intervene. So the Palestinians took it to Europe, and it turned out we didn't care anyway, so it failed. But that kind of, the kind of Caucasus is in the region where, to some extent, the Al-Qaeda narrative that we've allowed disastrous things to be done to them by bad people, suggesting it's surprising that hasn't been brought to our doorstep. So the follow-on question for that is, if you look around the rest of the world where you say, okay, there are other places kind of like this, where can we expect similar things to come from in the future? Is it places in Africa? Is it Indonesia? Is it Timor? It's a kind of it just suggests me that the violent, we use violence as states very effectively, but we kind of expect non-state actors not to use violence as a technique against us when it can be shown to be effective. So how do we even think about that in a world that becomes more volatile, where there are more movement of people from more areas where there's conflict and tension?
Thanks.
Can I jump in there? I still think the odd part here is that these are Chechens attacking the United States. It's not a typical, I mean, for all the incursions of Wahhabism and Salafism in that region, it's still very odd that the Chechens chose Boston. And so I have to say that, I don't think that all these regions of the world are necessarily, I mean, it's a good question, but I don't think they're all going to necessarily end up in Boston. I think it's more plausible that these were very, very unstable individuals. And that's, because historically the Chechens have no beef with the United States that I know of. Go ahead, Peter.
A couple of points. So, I mean, one is going back to the point you just made and one before by Jeanne. So, like 95% of terrorist attacks are committed locally within a few miles of where people are living or growing up. So a lot of this is just, if these people want to commit an attack, it's a target of convenience. So it's not necessarily they looked on a map and they thought, what is the best possible target I can strike, the Boston Marathon? It's, I grew up and I live around Watertown or wherever else, and what's a big thing close by? Okay, the Boston Marathon, that's a good soft target, I can hit that. It'll have some of the elements that Steve's talking about in terms of notoriety, public cameras, et cetera, though again, if you look at it from another context, it was one of the worst targets these people could possibly have picked, because A, they got on camera immediately and are caught immediately. B, they're morons who attack a freaking marathon that happens every year, and what is a marathon? A marathon is a time when a community comes together, you sit there on the side of the road cheering people you've never met in your entire life, regardless of their religion or ethnicity or whatever else. And this is exactly the type of thing that brings a community together and makes it resilient, which is exactly the way you would not want to strike if you were trying to divide a community or have some type of broader political impact. So I think in one sense, the biggest argument to me that makes sense is it's a target of convenience, and it's not something dreamed up by a group or even these individuals as being the best one. It's one close by them they could hit, but again, they weren't the brightest bulbs in the box, in my opinion, in the sense that they picked a target that I think is actually going to, in the end, make make sure that their memory is not going to be a good one, is going to actually strengthen this community. So that's one point. In terms of talking about them as Chechen or whatever else, I think that this is where getting to talking about their identity versus what they were doing can get difficult, because I totally agree with the point that, if you're a nationalist Chechnyan or whatever else, this would be a terrible attack. You would never want to do this. Why would you bring another enemy? That makes no sense from the nationalist angle whatsoever. But it is important to note that ethnic Chechens have been fighting in Al-Qaeda and other Al-Qaeda-linked groups for a while. There have been groups from Al-Qaeda, et cetera, have been fighting in Chechnya. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that there are individuals from this ethnicity who have been fighting in some of these groups elsewhere and whatnot. If you look actually in Afghanistan, some of the most effective and fiercest fighters in Al-Qaeda and some of the Taliban-related groups were Chechnyan. So on the one sense, I totally agree with the point that it doesn't necessarily mean because they are Chechnyan they did this. It could be for personal reasons. I hadn't thought through the Lauren Taylor thing, but that's somewhat interesting. Nonetheless, I would say long and short, to me, the target of convenience, perhaps still being inspired by some broader jihadi ideology, makes the most sense. But in terms of why people commit violence, I've already talked too long, so I won't say more about that. But one thing I would say real quick is organizational competition is a big one. So if you think about when this stuff happens and when it really gets tricked up to a high level, you get into a context where you have multiple organizations in Chechnya fighting against the Russians, or in the Palestinian context, multiple organizations who are not just trying to fight the Israelis or fighting the Russians, they're also competing with each other for kind of market share, popular support, et cetera. That's when you see more and more extreme attacks and in higher and higher numbers, so these groups can kind of stick out to their base to get more support. So that is one of the things we do know that does make a difference.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Sappho Gilbert. I'm an undergrad student, political science minor. I guess one of the questions I have doesn't relate so much to the geopolitical or the religious type arguments, but in terms of a case-by-case basis, we do get a lot of intelligence coming our way from other countries, and it has been reported that Russia had reached out to the United States. We are a country that since 9/11 has tried to balance both individual liberties but also national security. I'm just curious, what type of policy outcome change do you think might happen, or what would be more effective in balancing these two values that we do hold dearly, particularly given the terrorist acts of the past 2 decades, I would say?
Thanks. Anyone want to, Peter, you spoke to that a bit earlier.
Sure, yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm talking too much, but I'll say quickly. That's a great question. To me, that is the central question we have to face as a society. I mean, not just on the Boston attacks, but in general. And it doesn't just have to be a choice. Sometimes it's presented as a false choice. We can have more security, you can have more freedom. You can make a pretty strong argument that having more freedom might also make you more secure, because again, it makes people feel more integrated in society. They're not feel like they're being profiled, et cetera. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. But I do think there is a tension to some degree. And as I said, with video cameras or drones or giving people access to emails and these types of things, every society has to make these choices. And you can look around the world and people have made different choices. I mean, the way that Israel conducts itself versus the United States versus London and the British is actually quite different on a number of these areas. So I guess what I would say in terms of what I expect to happen as a result of just Boston, I really do think we're going to have more video cameras guaranteed, almost guaranteed downtown here. It's going to become more the way it is in London. I think that that's something that overall American people on polling seem to be supportive of, or at least not really strongly anti. I think that will happen. And the thing that I'm very interested to see is the extent to which you are going to see something like this lockdown happen the next time something like this occurs. And I think that it will depend in large part on the size of the city and who's running it. Because if you remember back when we had the snowstorm this winter, it was illegal to go on the highways, right? I know someone who got arrested for driving on the highway during the snowstorm. So to some degree, it can just also be the governor, whoever's in charge, kind of seeing this as a good way to go. But I also think that Boston might be the biggest possible city, it's often called like the biggest small town in America, that could actually have this happen, because I just don't think physically you could do something like what happened here in New York, like a lockdown or something like that. So that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be debated. I just think that it gets to the realm of impossibility to be able to do that. But long and short of it is, I think emails, domestic drones, these types of things, services like the FBI and CIA will push for this stuff. Because from their opportunity, they have a job they have to do. They want to have all the technology they can to try to do it. That doesn't mean that that's necessarily wrong, but it doesn't mean as citizens, we're the ones who actually get to decide that. So I would just encourage you to think about this stuff, and whatever your opinion is, make sure it's heard, because a lot of times when mistakes like this gets made, it's because, we can just trust who's ever running things, that they'll know the right thing to do, and they can just have, unlimited power to do this type of thing. And that's where I think we really run into trouble.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on that. I had a reporter ask me recently why the first suspect in the recent mailings of these ricin letters was actually shackled and then chained to a chair while he was being interrogated by the FBI. And the only answer I could give back was, they don't think it's just a crime. They think it's a national security issue. You see, that person, turned out it was the wrong man, right? Yeah. But they thought he had sent a dangerous letter to President Obama, to a member of Congress, and then to a sitting judge. So this is the fascinating thing about the FBI, because you see them, and you saw it after 9/11, the breaking down of doors and the absolutely rogue, behavior on the part of field agents who had in their minds not criminality, but national security. So see, it ups everything, and Peter, absolutely right. It ups everything, and by the way, your budget is really much more secure. Your budget is really better off. All the years that the FBI put white-collar crime at the top, nothing compared to now. Counterterrorism is at the top, national security and intelligence are at the top, and the budget is actually much more secure, because that's the last thing that you're really going to get rid of.
Anyone else want to speak
Big change.
to the trade-off, notional trade-off between security and freedom?
Yeah.
I guess I'd like to ask the panel, maybe Peter in particular, well, what grades do you give the Bush administration and the Obama administration across the board on how they handled this trade-off? You were speaking really to the issue of surveillance, but
sure.
During the Bush administration, we also saw the administration engage in warrantless wiretaps. Despite the fact that they had a legal framework for conducting these wiretaps, they chose to break the law and do them illegally. We saw the Obama administration recently affirm the right of the president to declare somebody to be a terrorist combatant and arrest them without any due process.
Yeah.
Well, John McCain said it today. There's an op-ed in the Globe. John McCain and 2 senators saying that we should treat Jahar, this 19-year-old kid, as an enemy combatant.
Right.
Right.
So yeah, it's still. Sorry.
Right.
And Guantanamo and a couple of other
And
things.
then the entire use of torture, which was really quite remarkable, and really had no precedent in American history. And I would say, number one, the torture happened and became a routine instrument of American counterterror. And number two, the Obama administration has not prosecuted anybody for this massive violation of law. What grades do you give?
It's a tough question. I guess I just became a professor, so now I have to give grades, right? Steve, I used to just get grades from Steve, and that was much easier. So a real quick point I would just say to that, and then I'll answer the question, is I just want to be clear. The FBI and these organizations that are doing this stuff, I think, have overstepped their bounds in a number of ways. But I'll also say that we as a public are not innocent here. If the FBI does not publish those photos, and those guys then go on to New York, as some people say they might have, and kill more people, the very first thing that's going to happen is Congress is going to haul the FBI before them and say, what were you guys doing? You had these photos. You didn't release them to the public. We are demanding transparency. Every media organization is on your door demanding this stuff. So I just want to say that, on the one hand, we're criticizing them, and I think in fair terms, but it's also fair to understand that they're under enormous pressure by people like us to demand this type of information. And they have tough decisions just as we do. So I'll add that real quick. In terms of the grades, I would say, first and foremost as a caveat, one of the most interesting things to me is how hard the Obama administration criticized the Bush administration before coming into office, and all the things you mentioned, Steve, and then how similarly they acted when they were there, which makes me ask a couple of questions. One, is there information that we don't know without having a security clearance that they have access to, and Obama sees much more than he did before and decides these are the right decisions? I'm not sure. Two, is it simply the fact that he decides politically this is what the American people are willing to accept, as much as there was anger at Guantanamo, whatever else? He realizes that there is a minority in the US that gets very agitated about this, but the majority is kind of don't ask, don't tell, or don't want to talk about it. And so he decides he wants to deal with bigger fish to fry like healthcare or something else. I'm not sure. In terms of my grades for what he's done, I think a lot of it comes down to questions that I'm not sure if I have a 100% answer to, which is whether torture is actually effective for getting information. I generally have a bias towards the fact that I don't think that it is, but I also am open to the fact that I think there probably are cases where it has worked. But that doesn't mean the broader question of is the cost of doing that, what it means to human rights and the way we're seen in society, might be not worth even the small benefits it gets every once in a while. So in that sense, I'd say incomplete because I don't know. In terms of broader grades about foreign policy, to the extent that this gentleman's question and others about U.S. foreign policy play a role here, and I think that they do, drawing down forces in Iraq and Afghanistan and not kind of chasing the brass ring that supposedly is always just around the bend and doesn't seem to get any better, I think is a positive. And so I think he gets higher marks for that. But I think a lot of these other issues, he just had a speech yesterday, right, at the press conference about closing Guantanamo and how this is still something he aspires to do, especially with this growing hunger strike there, but that has not done. I think he really does want to do it. I just think there's huge political and legal issues to do it, and I'm not sure of the pathway to get there. So again, I feel like I'm punting on all this stuff, but borderline incomplete, maybe at high marks for effort to the extent that you think that's a good idea, but low marks for delivery. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
We don't know his curve.
Thank you.
Sir, please identify yourself.
Rick Shaw. Is this on?
It is.
Okay. Face recognition is not on, right? Rick Shaw from here. Two bits that I don't hear talked about too much. The probability that perhaps this was just a demo for another entity somewhere else, and that they chose at least a legal designation of Patriots Day to perform the demo on.
Is there a question?
No.
Okay. Sir?
Alec Wood, and I think my question is probably directed to you, Peter. You just mentioned that the two suspects had planned to explode the remaining bombs they had, or pipe bombs, or allegedly, allegedly, in New York City. But my question is, an official in New York City made the comment that these individuals wouldn't even get across the Tappan Zee Bridge or the George Washington Bridge, wouldn't get to Times Square, wouldn't have been able to perpetrate the bombs. And my question is, within what is in the public domain, can you comment on what security New York City may have in place that other cities would want to emulate?
Yeah, well, they absolutely, I mean, Times Square is one of the most, guarded places, public spaces in the United States, and I think that the comments that I saw, I don't know if you're talking about Bloomberg or other people's comments, but the ones I saw about saying, yes, we know this is a target all the time, and so we're always watching it, I think is true. To the comment that they wouldn't have even gotten there, I mean, Faisal Shahzad got there with a car full of explosives, and thank God the detonator didn't work. But if it had, we would have had large numbers of deaths in Times Square just a few years ago. So it's not like it just in the past couple of years, I think they've really stepped things up even more. I mean, I'm sure after that failed attempt, they have a bit, but that's almost 10 years after 9/11. So again, the difficulty of a lone individual who has access or ability to build a bomb, which unfortunately, even though a lot of these people have failed, is not as difficult as we all might think. This is one of those things we're just going to unfortunately have to deal with to some degree as a free society. I think that we can lessen the risk, but the bravado that this would never have happened, I think, is more of a political point than reality. I think, unfortunately, we've seen again and again people like this have been able to slip through the nets. It's not like the Boston Marathon finish line had low amounts of security. There were police officers all over the place there, and yet we're not searching every single person's backpack who's coming in there, and if you're not doing that, this is possible.
By the way, about New York is absolutely amazing. It has more security structure in terms of every federal organization you could imagine, Homeland Security, and certainly the FBI has its own really almost independent office there, and just an incredible network. In addition to the fact that the police force of New York is 30,000 people. I mean, 30,000 policemen in New York is absolutely amazing. I can't think of another city in the world, but you're right. Is it perfect? Is it always going to work? And no, it can't protect you. But we do have this expectation, of what people in the sciences call equilibrium. We keep thinking that society is going to be in a state of equilibrium. Actually, society is dynamic. It's in constant state of disequilibrium. Bad things happen. And but we do have this. I think we get used to orderly lives. And we have expectations that these lives are going to be totally, or nothing's going to disrupt us. And then there's another thing that's also happening with us. And I'm reacting here to a book I read recently by a man named Matt Ridley. It's on rational optimism. Why do we keep acting as if there's more violence now than, let's say, 25 or 30 years ago, when in fact the violence curve is down? Why do we keep acting as if our lives are at constant risk? We've never been in better health on the planet. And the book is 800 pages long, and he goes over everything. that is better. Now, it's not great and it's not perfect, right? But it's better. And we've had this with Steven Pinker, by the way. Mary Kaldor, a wonderful writer on military and political issues, made this argument about 5 or 6 years ago. It's actually better, but we don't think it's better. And we get very concentrated on risk, national security, looking here and there, you know, and we're going to be, I tell you, the other day, I was coming here on the T, and there was a fellow with dark hair who had a black backpack on. Well, how did I think about that? Well, I moved away, see? So that's part of the resonance. That's part of being coerced by these events. But in general, we're actually doing pretty well. You know, what I'm saying here, we shouldn't really be succumbing to fear. I guess that's really what I'm saying.
Let's try to get a couple more questions in. Yes.
Hi, I'm a 2013 graduate of the MIT Sloan School. After so much talk about the global context, I'm wondering what role you see in education, given that we've talked about not fearing the other, about understanding that there's radicals in every religion and that there's not something inherent in Islam that predisposes Muslims to violence, and about the refugee deficit and how important it is to assimilate and integrate and welcome people who may be feeling a sense of otherness. What role arts education, avenues for creative self-expression we should be thinking about in our schools, given their non-security, that they are not the FBI. What role does education play in this global context for you?
Who wants to take that? Sylvia, your
in terms
comments
of
were closest.
education, like are you thinking in terms of like elementary school, high school?
I am. I'm thinking of K through 12, of creating more educated citizens that don't jump to illogical and stereotypes, and that may create a better society that doesn't breed these sort of actions, both the initial action and perhaps uninformed responses like we've been hearing.
Yeah, well, you know, my son goes to the Cambridge French and Latin School. And, you know, I think that there are places like Cambridge and Latin which do a really good job at exactly that. I mean, one of the things, if I remember well reading some years ago when they were trying to figure out what words to use for the high school, the kids came up with the words, and they were opportunity and respect were 2 of the 3 words. I don't remember the 3rd one, but you know, you can't create these kind of environments. I'm not saying that that's a panacea and that it works really well for all children there, but you can't create environments where people are respected, where kids are respected no matter where they come from, where they're not necessarily bullied, for example, or made fun of because they are foreigners or because they are immigrants or because they don't speak English or whatever that question may be. So I do think that there's a role for education, and I think that establishing those types of environments where where kids are taught to be more respectful of difference go a long way. But it's also helpful to have environments where there's heterogeneity. You know, if you're in a lot of environments in education in the United States, there's a lot of segregation, and you end up with very homogeneous environments where people don't have access to people who are different from them, and who don't necessarily know how to respect people who are different. So you know, there's you know, this is something that really has to come down to you know, being in situations where people have a lot of contact with people who are not like them. And that only happens in situations where there's more heterogeneity.
I just want to make a quick plug for a program called Facing History that's done in the middle and high school kids, teaching kids to look at situations of atrocity and move out of what Silvia so wisely remarked on as the American tendency toward naivete. And so I think if you've studied the Gulag in the Soviet period, then you hear about Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib, it creates a different response if you've actually studied people who've suffered in that kind of thing.
Your question also raised in me the question of whether anything can be done in terms of education or life or whatever in these places where people like the Tsarnaev brothers come from. And certainly in Dagestan and Chechnya, the Russians talk a good game, but because of the corruption and everything else, nothing's happening. There's no peaceful context in which these kids or their relatives have grown up and are thriving because of the endemic violence, and any money that's given from the center is pocketed by some official somewhere. And I think that goes across the board. I think both the post-Soviet space and certainly beyond.
Thanks. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I almost hate to bring up this issue.
Please identify yourself.
Yes. The name is Bob Rosenberg, and involved in business and also international relations for over 20 years. You touched also on the issue not only of the physical security and dealing with individuals who might be dangerous, but there's also the fact that after 9/11, a lot of laws were put in place that don't have the safeguards that other things do for the citizens of this country. And so I'd like to see that be part of this discussion as well. Obviously not much time now, but maybe for a future discussion.
Thank you. We have time for the two folks who are at the microphones. Why don't I ask you each to ask your question? I'll turn it over to the panel. I'll let those who feel like they want to respond, and then I'll thank everyone for coming. So why don't we go here and then there?
Sure. I just arrived. I'm not sure if this question has been addressed, but along the lines with education, I decided to educate myself the other day, and I looked up Google and Bing. This is MIT, so numbers should matter. I wanted to find out how many bombing sorties U.S./NATO planes performed in Libya. And the number is about 8,500 sorties that the bombs were dropped. And when you look at the pictures of the bombs exploding, approximately 15,000 bombs, each bomb that exploded in Libya is about 100 times more powerful than average pressure cooker bomb. And I do remember Obama criticized Bush government by being the warmonger, and then he received the Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize, and then we still dropped 15,000, the best bombs we could ever make in a country called Libya. How can you explain this?
Okay, first question, last question.
Okay, my name is Kim Serkin. I teach in Women and Gender Studies, and I'm currently teaching class on gender and technology, but also teach gender and media. So we've been following a lot of these questions, and I'm interested in the relationship between the surveillance issue and the civil liberties issue, but particularly if anybody is making any connections with CISPA, because this was passed by the House on Thursday, the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act, which is essentially warrantless searching. And I'm wondering, you know, I mean, obviously the Senate has not agreed to hear it. In some ways, I think this is related to the question of Bush versus Obama, right? Because Obama at least has come on with this sort of veto threat in a statement today on that we need to have a more attention to privacy. But I guess I'm wondering if, you know, if there's more of a need to make connections between these sorts of laws, which are, you know, originally framed as specifically against cyber terrorism, but which are getting kind of blanketly, you know, brought in to address other issues like child porn. Again, national security becomes a button, and what the implications are. I'm particularly interested if anybody has been following the issue of the deleted Instagram account, and, you know, why we might even be interested in having warrantless searches when it seems that the government could easily, reasonably justify recovering an Instagram account without having to do these backdoor sorts of investigations. There was one issue. The other two, really quick. The issue of change versus. You know, kind of, I mean, we saw they picked the wrong city, right? In editorial in the New York Times, and whether making any changes in the name of security is actually capitulating, right, to the fear, such as maybe you suggested by moving away from the person with the backpack, right? But I spend a lot of time in Philadelphia, and the Philadelphia Broad Street Run, which is coming up this Sunday, they've made dramatic changes. They won't allow any bags in. All the runner bags have to be transparent. And whether, you know, is there a balance between common sense and, you know, fear or capitulation? And finally, if there's any connection to be made between the boxing and the violence in boxing, and and this action.
Okay, thank you. Let me turn it back to the panel. Anyone want to respond either to the questions or offer final summary remarks? It's up to you. Peter?
Sure. Real quick to the Libya point. So there's a great dissertation that was written by a student from MIT named Brendan Green talking about intervention and saying, well, the Democrats and Republicans really disagree about foreign policy in the sense that they both want to intervene, but for different reasons. And so Republicans often really want to intervene, for regime change or, kind of along the lines with what President Bush did in Iraq. The Obama administration, some of the people who support him, like Susan Rice and Samantha Power, they really want to intervene as well. They just want to do it for humanitarian reasons, so stopping a genocide or things of this nature. So at the end of the day, you could say, well, the Obama administration criticized the Bush administration on this, yet they intervened quite a bit. And I think you could generally say, looking at the debates between Obama and Romney on this stuff, a lot of differences on domestic policy, foreign policy. They seem to get along pretty well. Now, you can agree or disagree with that, but that's an important point. In terms of the U.S. dropping those bombs, what the Obama administration and supporters of that would say is, yes, but the reason for that is because the Gaddafi regime is hopefully not one that you would necessarily support, and this was designed to try to remove him from power. Now, you could say, well, violence in any context is not worthwhile, and that's a stance that many people, pacifists or otherwise, might support, but that would be the stance of the government. In terms of the point about trading off of liberties and whether we're being too fearful in this stuff, I think there's a couple key things. One is whether you're doing something for the short term or it's kind of a long-term policy. So I understand to some degree right after an attack, like the London Marathon or something that happens, they have slightly stepped up security issues just because they're worried about a copycat or someone else doing it right after that. Whereas if Philadelphia going forward has a policy of no bags in their marathon 5 years from now, I would see that as a major problem. This time, I would still maybe see that might be a bit of overkill, but there's kind of short-term versus long-term in how you do this. You still have to be concerned about precedent, but that's something. In terms of being fearful, I would echo Jeanne's point as well, which is I don't think that we should have necessarily no reaction to these attacks, because at the end of the day, we should be deciding as a society what's a threat and trying to protect ourselves. But we shouldn't act out of fear, and hopefully the knowledge of how many people are actually killed in these attacks, how likely you are to be killed by a terrorist attack versus a car accident or a lightning strike or homicide with a gun, which is an issue that wasn't brought up here, but is in the news because of Newtown and these types of things. Hopefully at least makes you feel like this is a scary proposition that you could be targeted for any reason. You can't control it, and I think that's one of the reasons we get more scared about terrorism than, say, other things. But long and short of it is, at least as of now, until if and when terrorist groups or non-state groups get access to nuclear weapons or things like this, the likelihood of them being able to cause mass death is thankfully still quite low. And so we should be able to still have reasoned debates and discussions about these things and recognize that there are a lot of great things about this country and the liberties we have that we shouldn't be so quick to kind of dispense with.
Anyone else want to?
I could say something
Silvia.
about the boxing. I understand that it was his father that taught him to box and got him, into boxing and really pushed him. I also understand that he was quite a character. That I think boxing for him was this whole thing. It wasn't just getting rid of whatever aggression he may have had, but nevertheless, he would wear furs, like white furs, and he would appear in very artistically different kinds of ways to all of the bouts, et cetera, et cetera. So he was building a whole persona around his boxing that I think allowed him to have a particular type of identity, which I think he was very much wanting. So I think that boxing, in a way, can keep you from being violent to other people if you're somebody who's very aggressive. Or it can just be a way of getting ahead. This is, if you have if you can, it's usually people who are disfranchised who go into boxing. It's not people who are middle class or who have possibilities. So, there's different reasons for boxing. But I think for him, I'm kind of like, sorry that he wasn't allowed to go on boxing, because maybe he would have been okay with that. I don't know. There's all these other things that could have come in between, but he was definitely very interested and really wanted to build a persona around the boxing.
There's an MIT boxing club.
Okay, does anyone else have a final word that they want to share? We do these Starr forums on a regular basis, but we've never done one in my memory for 3 hours, and I want to thank you. This could have continued. And in fact, I was just cutting this gentleman off. I apologize, but thank the panel with me. And thank the real organizer, Michelle. Thank you very much. And Rebecca, where is she? Is she here? Thank you all very much for coming.